Good morning. I am a longtime friend and supporter of the Municipal Art Society, and for many years had the privilege of serving on its board. I've always appreciated the value of MAS's advocacy and thoughtful leadership, ensuring that New York City's built environment, cultural assets, and infrastructure are planned, designed, and capitalized in ways that support the city's continued economic and cultural sustainability, two concepts that are inseparable. You've just heard and had the chance to hear a bit about New Yorkers' views about how livable they find the city to be. We should now turn our attention to something we heard reflected in those results that concern most New Yorkers, the state of the economy. Land use matters to the economy locally and ultimately nationally. And if New York is to contribute to the national gains, foreign must follow function. One way in which we see that is through a really a superb port system, so we can actually increase exports as our president has demanded the economy must. We also need to have continued infrastructure improvement and investment in public transportation. Nationally, it takes 90 minutes for somebody to travel by public transportation to a high-quality job. In New York, I'm sure the statistics are slightly lower, but that's still unacceptable if we plan to have an engaged workforce of a variety and economic opportunities for those of lower wage and lower skill base. And finally, zoning really matters. We have an X zoning in New York, which is the opportunity to upzone some former manufacturing from M1, M2, and M3 to mixed use, which would allow for a good deal of economic diversity and would enable additional housing for those in the lower income strata. But rather than hear it from me, you have the chance to hear it from a really dynamic panel today, and I'd like to introduce them. Bruce Katz is the vice president at the Brookings Institution and founder of the Metropolitan Policy Program there. He'll give us a national view. Barbara Byrne Denham is the chief economist with Eastern Consolidated. She tracks New York's local conditions on an almost daily basis. And Kevin Stolarick from the Rotman School's Martin Prosperity Institute has worked for many years on the importance of the creative class and its implications, which are so relevant for cities like New York. Chairing this session that will inform all of our discussions that follow over the next 2 days is the Lawrence C. Nussdorf Chair of Urban Research and Education at the University of Pennsylvania and MAS's board chair, Eugenie Birch. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. As you can imagine, this is the most important topic of this conference. At least we think so, this group that's sitting right here, because it is the economy, it is the engine of growth that's going to inform our 3 Ds, right? Absolutely. So we're going to ask each of our guests to give us a little presentation from their view of what they think we should be thinking about here today, and then we'll have a deeper conversation. So would you like to start, Bruce?
Absolutely. First of all, great to be here. Unbelievable space, what makes New York special. Here's a sort of view from the national and global perspective of where New York City fits. I think we're going through a shock decade in the United States. First half of this decade, 2008 to essentially next year, we're recovering from this great recession. And it's obviously no bounce back. We need to purposefully restructure our economy in this country from consumption and debt and waste to an economy that's fueled by innovation, as Cheryl said, driven by exports, rich with opportunity. One stat to think about, we need to basically grow 11.2 million jobs just to make up the jobs we lost in this recession and then to keep pace with population growth. And if we take the average growth from last decade, it'll take us to August 2020 to make up that jobs deficit. It's not enough to grow more jobs, we got to grow better jobs. And I think what has happened in this economy is we have ceased to grow middle wage jobs. We're seeing nationally a decline of about 3.5 million middle-class families over the past decade or so. And that's because our economy has basically been very good at the high end, been very good at the low end, but is not quite producing those middle wage jobs. That's the first half of this decade. We're restructuring. I think New York City, under Mayor Bloomberg's direction, is doing as best a job, and we'll come back to this about the policy bit, about how to restructure. The second half of this decade, it's not just the economy. It's the fiscal situation. Whoever wins this election we're going to see Washington, D.C. scale back at monumental proportions so it can live within their means. Think healthcare, think housing, think infrastructure, all the ways in which federal resources, whether on the spending side or the tax side, help buttress, support, leverage, grow this economy. So shock decade, and frankly, it's up to us to decide, is this going to be a decade where the United States finally, and New York City, finally gets its act together, or is this going to be a lost decade like Japan had? I think that's the challenge for us. Philip, I loved your remarks. A lot of what you're describing is absolutely essential to the decision about which decade we're going to have.
Thanks, Bruce. Well, Barbara, there's a challenge. Let's hear what you would like to tell us.
Okay, I guess I'm the geek in the room. I'm the first person to have brought slides to present. I want to thank the earlier speakers who presented a lot of things on the New York City economy, especially the deputy mayor, who highlighted a lot of what I have to say here. What I want to do is just give you a background of what New York City economy has looked like over the last 10 and 25 years. So this first slide shows New York City employment growth. All these slides have to do with employment growth since 1990. And I always compare New York City to the United States because you need the context of where we are versus the rest of the country. And as you can see, from 2004 through 2008, New York City grew at the same rate as the national economy. That's very rare. We usually grow slower or faster. But we were on pace with the national economy for those 4 years. And then starting in 2007, we diverged. Oddly enough, the national recession started before the New York City recession, even though the financial crisis was headquartered here. And you can see the national economy lost disproportionately more jobs than New York City did, and we recovered more jobs, vastly more jobs. We've actually added 200,000 jobs since the bottom of 2009. And as the deputy mayor mentioned earlier, that's the highest employment level we've had since statistics were counted, which is the 1950s. We surpassed the high water mark of 1969. But if you look at the job growth over the last 5 years vis-a-vis the history, this just goes back to 1990. And you can see the differences. If I could take this to 1990, I could have taken it to 1950, and it would have looked the same. That is, the US economy, other than the last 5 years, has had almost a direct upward trajectory of job growth over the last 5 or 6 decades. And New York City has been a roller coaster ride. The brown line there is New York City's economy. You can see it's gone up, it's gone down. And why is that? Well, one reason is Wall Street. The green line there, look how volatile that is. That's employment growth just in Wall Street. And then the orange line is the job growth in the office sector. So we have a very cyclical economy. That's just endemic to the history of New York City. And why is that? It's the nature of New York City, but it's also, it has a lot to do with the cost of doing business in New York City. And I think that's one of our challenges here, is that we have not just a high cost of doing business, but the perception of a high cost of doing business and a high cost of living. Before I get into that and the challenges, I just want to show you, I'm sure you're curious, well, where are these jobs? And this is the job growth since the bottom of the recession by industry. And look at the top 2 industries there, well, 3. I think one of them didn't make it up there. But the top 2 industries are restaurants and retail trade. So this is tourism. This is a third of the economy. The third of the job growth since the depth of the recession is in restaurants and retail. This is fantastic news. Our economy is doing great. We've added more jobs this year than we will have added since 1999. But so many of the jobs are in low-skilled industries. Again, this is good because it keeps our unemployment rate low, even though our unemployment rate isn't low. But most of these jobs don't have benefits. They don't have pensions. And the other areas of job growth are mostly business services jobs, healthcare and education. Healthcare and education jobs are great. We know that not only are the universities expanding, but almost every private school in New York City and preschools are expanding in New York City. But one industry you don't quite see there probably is Wall Street. One of the biggest complaints about New York City's economy back in the 80s and 90s is New York City needs to diversify away from Wall Street. Well, as you can see on this chart, the economy has diversified away from Wall Street. This is good news. We have a flourishing education industry here. We have great health care, and we have an amazing tourism industry. But what are some of the limitations we have? Here are the industries that have still lost jobs since September of 2009, which was the bottom of the economy. Government, construction, manufacturing, publishing, even the legal industry hasn't recovered its jobs, and of course real estate. Some of these job losses you see here are cyclical. Local government, construction, these are cyclical industries. They'll probably add jobs back in the next administration. It's just the nature of local government. But a lot of these job losses are structural. We'll never be getting these manufacturing jobs back. We'll probably never get the federal government jobs back. And as Bruce mentioned, it's these middle wage jobs that New York City needs. There was a great article yesterday on the growing income inequality in this country. We all know the social implications for that. It's just not healthy. But two economists from the IMF have done an economic study on the impact of income inequality on economic growth across the country. And they compared every different country. And they showed that it has a dramatic impact on long-term economic growth. It has a bigger impact than, say, foreign direct investment and a lot of other different factors. And I was so glad that that article came out yesterday, and I was able to read it and share it with you today. This is a very serious problem in New York City. I mean, it's great that we have so much wealth, and you can't even overestimate how much wealth we have in the city. Someone paid $88 million for an apartment last year. And we have job growth, again, in the low-skilled wages, but we really need the middle wage job growth. We have, teachers here, we have healthcare workers, but we really need an economic plan that really balances the growth across every income class.
Thanks, Barbara. But Kevin, give us a little perspective on New York and the global economy.
So, I feel like it's my job to be the ray of sunshine between bits of doom and gloom here. One of the big things, and one of the things I think that's always really interesting, right? I've been working with Richard Florida for 12 years now, and the whole thing is always talking about creativity and why that's so important. And I think what's amazing is that it is where jobs are growing the fastest. Creative workers, not all creative workers make tons of money, right? Although people have to think, it's, they're all highly paid. Well, there's a lot of people in this room that could definitely show otherwise. But it is interesting to note that the growth that is happening in New York in tourism, right, in accommodations, even in some of the retail stuff, that actually a lot of that is being driven by what's happening with arts and culture and those communities here, right? And so how those have been the way forward. So you actually do see that there is a way forward through creativity, through innovation. I think what's going on with Cornell and Technion, right, is the mayor is exactly saying, look, innovation really matters here, and this has got to be our way forward. And so I think there's this understanding that the manufacturing jobs, for the most part, are gone. I'm sorry to say that, but it's the truth. Now, what's coming back are the kinds of manufacturing jobs that you're seeing in Brooklyn. What you're finding are these small batch manufacturing. There's a colleague of mine at NYU likes to call it conspicuous production, right? Where what you have to see is you actually have to go and see the person, making the thing before you can buy it from them, because that's the only way you can really know that it's made in the USA. And so you do see that there are interesting and creative ways forward even with manufacturing. But I've always said that in terms of creative thinking in the creative class, and that really that creativity and innovation is the way forward, we've always been industry agnostic. It's not about particular industries. It's actually about being creative and innovative. Successful firms can be in any industry. What they have to be is they have to be creative and innovative. And so it's how you tap into that creativity and innovation, some of which comes from the arts community, some of which comes from the education community, some of which still comes from Hewlett and Packard's garage. Those are the kinds of things that are really going to be important going forward for the world as well as for New York.
All right, so we get that. I want to go back to the two sort of points that both Barbara and Bruce were making. 11.2 million jobs need to be created, right, nationwide. I don't know what our share of that is, but you're also saying they need to be middle wage jobs. And Barbara, you showed us numbers, but you didn't show us wages. You didn't show us the median wage. So what are we seeing in the growth in terms of this wage distribution? And Bruce, what are these middle wage jobs, and how are we going to create them?
Well, the problem is wage data is harder to get, so please excuse. It comes with a much bigger lag. And let me say, Wall Street, even though it's not driving the job growth, it's still the wealthiest and driving,
Of course, exactly.
biggest portion of wage growth. But you know, the burgeoning industry here right now is technology. And as Kevin mentioned, we are getting a new Cornell engineering school. Midtown South, is anyone who reads the newspaper knows, there's a growing technology industry here, and I think that's the future. You know, I can't give you an exact wage. I would say, you know, the average median wage right now is about $51,000 in New York City, and we need about that and a little higher, because we all know the cost of living here is very high. And you can't make it on a salary really under $100,000 living in New York City in most neighborhoods. But that said, there are other neighborhoods where you can, and so we need to tap into a lot of neighborhoods where the cost of living is lower. But back to your question, I think the key is, as someone mentioned earlier, export industries. Industries that drive revenues where we export our goods and our services. That's why education is so good, because people come here and buy our education services. Technology is fantastic. I think there's almost like a shift between, not I want to say a shift between Silicon Valley and ourselves, but Google is growing here, and there's a lot of ancillary economic activity just in Midtown South from this technology industry. And these are the types of jobs we need to really kind of build out our middle class.
Well, maybe we need to pay more attention to our livability survey and what boroughs were popular. Bruce, let's talk a little more about these moderate wage jobs. Is what Barbara's describing what you're talking about?
Absolutely. So again, it gets back to this starting point. We were the country of bad habits before the Great Recession, right? We really convinced ourselves that somehow if we built enough homes, we would have growth. It's absurd, right? A good economy drives housing. Housing doesn't drive a good economy. It's hard to say that in New York sometimes, but everyone's checking their real estate value. But in any event, so we're in the midst of a restructuring here, okay? And it's really the first time I think we're going through a purposeful restructuring. In theory, the national government should lead it. Not sure that's going to happen, irrespective of who gets elected. So it's going to be led from this level. It's going to be led by cities and metropolitan areas, the top 100 of which are 2/3 of our population and 3/4 of our GDP, and on every indicator that matters are at 75, 80, 85, 90% of the national average. So it's going to be led from below. We fundamentally have to reorient ourselves to the global economy. Fundamentally, because that's where growth is happening. 13% of American exports, or 13% of our GDP comes from exports, okay? Much higher levels in Japan, obviously in Germany, in China, in everywhere you go in the mature world, and in a good portion of the emerging world, exports as a share of national GDP is much higher. We need to get out more, right? And we need to sell our goods and our services on the global market, because we've been inward focused and present oriented. That's the way we're going to create more jobs. And frankly, that's the way we're going to create better jobs. Now, this is hard to do without a national government, frankly, because what you want a national government to do is set the rules of the game so it's more likely you'll support innovation over consumption and production over speculation, right? You want sustained investments in advanced R&D, which provides the platform by which you grow over time. That's why the Cornell Technion, is such a critical element. If we do not get the national government that we need, I think what's going to happen in this country is more and more responsibility for this kind of platform setting for prosperous, productive, sustainable, innovative growth is going to happen at this level. Very hard to do fiscally, but if the cavalry's not coming, who else is going to do it?
Yes, Kevin, sure.
Just one quick thing. I think one of the things to also think about, currently 50% of all workers in the U.S. work in a service class job, right? And that's a rapidly increasing share in New York, right? And service class workers only bring home 30% of the total wages. And so what happens, right, is you've got lots and lots of people. And the service work, the thing about service workers, so it is retail, it's accommodations, it's food service, right? No matter how hard I try, I send my dollar bills to Mumbai, and the little guy over there goes and gets his hair cut, and my hair stays the same length. We have to improve the quality and the value of these jobs. The service work that is out there needs to be more highly paid. It's not just about raising minimum wages, it's about improving the value of that work. And don't say it can't be done because it was done with manufacturing. Before World War II, manufacturing jobs sucked. They were horrible, they were dirty, they were tough, they were nasty. By the time the war ended, manufacturing jobs became the really good middle-class jobs because we decided that these were important jobs and that people should earn a living wage and be able to support their family, and the idea of an American dream was built on the back of auto workers from General Motors and Ford and people that I grew up with that were building John Deere tractors. Those jobs are gone. The economy has changed. It is a global economy. They're not there. But the jobs that we still have are the people who are cutting our hair and taking care of our parents and taking care of our kids and teaching and selling us things and bringing us our meals. And if we don't make those better, well-paying, more valuable jobs, and there are ways to do it, we're not going to be successful.
Well, let's get granular, Barbara. How do you think in New York City we're going to do these things that Bruce and Kevin are telling us we have to do?
Well, there's a lot of micro-level efforts to have like business incubators. And a lot of it is, has been done by the New York City Economic Development Corporation. A lot of it's done by Bloomberg. A lot of it's done by public and private efforts. But, I mean, I think these business incubators are a great idea. I know Lower Manhattan is doing this HELM project. It's called Hiring and Expanding in Lower Manhattan. And that, you know, they're actually like awarding grants to companies that come to Lower Manhattan and start a business or expand a business. And these efforts are really crucial. And they also advertise, again, outside of New York City, that the cost of doing business here is high, but actually there's a lot of neighborhoods where it's not so high. I mean, you can get a rent in Lower Manhattan for below $30 a square foot, as you can in the Garment District, or Midtown West, I guess as we should call it. So I think the more we explore areas of, you know, broadening the perception of New York City as not necessarily being such a high cost of doing business, but it's actually feasible. And we do have the creative talent here. I remember Richard Florida's great piece where he said we need three things: talent, technology, and tolerance. New York City has all of those things thriving. So, I mean, a lot of it is a PR effort, but, you know, Long Island City has great business opportunities, and there's office space, and there's city incentives. It's really just about getting the word out and marketing that, you know, this is a very hospitable place to start a business.
I was waiting for you to be non-Manhattan, so I was hoping at least you brought up some of these other boroughs that we have where there's plenty
Yeah,
of
I mean, even in the Bronx and Harlem, there's tremendous opportunities.
There's an elephant in the room you haven't talked about: unemployment, income diversity. You want to talk a little bit about that? How are we going to address that?
Again, I mean, 11.2 million jobs deficit. Here's another shock number from a shock decade. In 2000, 80 million people in the United States were either poor or near poor. Near poor is just 150% of the poverty level, which is obviously impossible to live on. 2010, 104 million people. 80 million in 2000, 104 million in 2010. One decade. I think a lot of that, frankly, was attributed not just to the Great Recession, but to losing 6 million manufacturing jobs, right? Because those are good jobs. Those pay well, and they radiate, they have multiplier effects at very substantial numbers. So we've got an enormous hill to climb here. There are some obvious things that frankly should have been done in the last couple years if anyone in Washington was able to get along with each other, right? Particularly around energy efficiency, energy retrofit, and making the housing sector the kind of productive and innovative sector that Kevin's talking about, right? So there were a lot of things that could have been unleashed with primarily private sector capital with smart rules and regulation. Gets back to Phil's point. Didn't happen. Maybe can happen over the next 4 years. But, you know, Washington is on a frolic and a detour. I mean, a fundamental frolic and detour. And I think from the city perspective, what we have to now do is rethink how we engage with, in theory, the top of our system, but frankly, the bottom of our system. And we have to think about unleashing the power and energy of the talent in innovative firms, in innovative clusters in these kinds of cities. So it's a new compact that has to be drawn. If they're going to scale back $4 trillion over the next decade, we better have a new deal with Washington, D.C.
And actually, Bruce, you're not just talking about city within political boundaries. You're talking about metro regions, aren't you? That's your...
The metro scale is the right scale economic geography. Now, New York City, because of 8 million people, became a metropolis, I guess, in 1898, likes to think of itself at the metro scale, and it's hard not to. But the real power, the real geography, the real unit of the economy here and abroad is the metropolitan scale. Cities, suburban, exurban environments, that's the scale that competes globally. And so when you're thinking about housing, when you're thinking about some of these other issues, infrastructure in particular, whether it's freight or passenger, you've got to bring New Jersey into the mix. You've got to bring Nassau into the mix, and then maybe even Southern Connecticut. Hard to do, but you know, you're New Yorkers, so.
Okay, 10 seconds each, 10 seconds
Well,
each.
just one, I guess
Right?
a quick,
Okay.
yeah, yes, really quick. One of the things that I think is tremendously, the great opportunity is the mayor, right? Mayor Bloomberg and what he has done and what he is going to do next, I think is actually pointing out what Bruce said, right? Washington has abrogated their power on this, and it really is going to be up to local communities to step up. And I think what you're seeing is this kind of rise of the city writ large as being the most important actor.
Right, but we're going to have a new mayor, and that's going to be very interesting. 10 seconds.
Okay,
What should the new mayor do, Barbara?
Well,
Unless you want to say something else.
The mayor and the governor has drawn attention to, and I want to just get back to the statistics, and something I've been tracking for a while. It made national news that the unemployment statistics was diverging from the payroll employment numbers last month, and everyone was up in arms because Obama must have been manipulating the numbers. Well, that divergence has been going on in New York City all year, and it's actually saying the opposite things. We've added 200,000 jobs, but if you look at the unemployment rate, it hasn't moved. In fact, it shows that the number of residents employed in New York City has not changed since 2009. So there's something really, really wrong with the BLS data. I just want everyone, I say that because you need to take these statistics with a grain of salt because there's really something happening. I'm trying to get to the bottom of it, and today is the third Thursday, so the New York City employment data for September will come out today, and who knows what it's going to say because it's been a little crazy. But I think whenever you hear a statistic, as a statistician, I just want to implore you, consider that there's probably another story there.
Well, we all learned how to lie with statistics, but we hope we won't do that in the future. 10 seconds, what would you do if you were mayor?
I would try to preserve as much as Bloomberg is doing.
Okay, Kevin, what
Same
would you?
thing, I do the same.
Bruce?
Quadruple down on the applied science initiative and go global.
Okay.
Tourism to technology, that's the future.
Oh,
of export.
tourism to technology, that's the mantra. Thank you very much. Wonderful panel.